Abby, I thought you were on holiday.
Hello, hello. Calling in from about to start a drive. So I will not guarantee connectivity for the next 20 or so minutes, but I wanted to call in and see if I could listen in. So
Yeah,
yeah.
okay. Where are you headed?
Just back to the hotel, which is along the coast. So we were at a beach. Now we're gonna head back. So yeah,
Nice.
we're up in Norfolk, north coast of England.
Ah, betul.
Hey, as warned, I will probably be limited connectivity for a short bit, but just want to make sure we get the document in everyone's hands. It's in the working group channel, and I'm sure somebody can share it in the chat if you don't mind. But we're going to start with the discussion on today, if that makes sense.
Take the next left onto A149.
I've pasted a link into the chat if people want to jump on the dock.
Amazing, thank you. And it's like Corbin jumped in as well, who can, I'm sure, give a bit more of context. But as always, this is a bit of a different call than our usual, like twice monthly calls where it's a bit more ad hoc. Everyone raise hands, have conversations about anything. I guess the goal for today is that there's a whole bunch of stuff we want to do to get the assessment in a publishable state. But the thing we're probably furthest along with, because of the hard work from Corbin and Colin has had a look as well, is just how somebody can place themselves on the model. So we know that we need to figure out how to determine where they should be on the model. We know we need to determine how to guide them to deal with any gaps between the two. But so really what this is about is reviewing the existing questions and figuring out what the next steps are to get to a point where we're, as a group, comfortable with these questions, placing people on the model. So that's really all the intro, I think.
Yeah, that's awesome. Hey everyone. So I did publish the document pretty late last night here, West Coast time. We had a holiday, so I was just getting back. And thanks, Chris. I see you went through it. So I would encourage everyone to maybe we could just take like a few minutes, just to give folks a little time to read through it if they haven't. They may be seeing it for the first time. Just in terms of context, uh, I've been using these questions as like a little bit of an internal pilot at AWS, where I'm like meeting with different organizations who are doing platform engineering. And so I would love to just get some feedback on these and as maybe a starting point, and then we'll see kind of where we take this in the future. in terms of like what makes the most sense, things like that. So maybe I'll just stop there and give you guys a few minutes to take a read.
Yeah, I put some comments in it, Corbin. First, I think it's a really good set of questions that you've come up with. Really liked them. I thought they were so. Obviously, if you've been using them, you've clearly refined them a lot. Because I did find them very, very clear, very good. I have put a couple of suggestions around some of them where it starts to get a bit subjective about the size of the organisation and the scope of the initiative, especially around some of the kind of international side of things. I think there's one question on the operational side about, does it span the whole organisation? Is that international as well? Yeah, it depends on the scope of the platform team, really, I think, and the usage. And when we start throwing overlays in there, like regulation, maybe some of these platform teams, well, they're never going to be international. They've got to be focused because of the regulation to perhaps just a geography. So maybe some of those questions might need a slight tweak in the wording, but yeah, really good set of questions.
Yeah, I think for me, like the biggest benefit of having this in front of you guys as a community is overcoming that bias. Because the organizations that I meet with are usually on sort of the far end of maturity. So it is challenging for me to like think about like people who are just getting started, right? So I've had a few of those conversations already with some folks, and so I'd like to work in as much as we can into this as well, right? Like Colin brought up a couple times when he was looking at this as well, saying, do we have to qualify somebody before we even talk to them about this, right? And the answer is like, yes, of course, we do need to have some form of qualification. And I can talk a little bit about how I do that, but for now, let's just focus on the content, and overcoming those biases, I think will be really, really good outcome for us.
So in looking at these questions, we have an interesting mix of things that are rather binary as an answer. But there's also a lot of conjunctions, right? So ands and ors and that sort of thing. Do you have a sense for um, how you call it that you want to keep the question simple to answer, so that we can start to align to the maturity levels. Do you anticipate having like a set of weighting on any of these questions? Are some questions unlocked by answers to previous questions, or do you have a sense for that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that, so I think that part of this exercise is going to be to, I think, change a little bit about the way that this works in general. So I don't know if you were part of some of the earlier discussions, but the way that I started this was by trying to assess risk associated with platform initiatives. And I think the feedback from this group was that like using the term risk was like not the best way of necessarily positioning this.
Mhm.
I use that term to kind of help organizations think about what are some challenges that might be coming down the road if they don't think about, making some changes to how they're doing platforms today.
Mhm.
So with each of these questions, there is today this notion of weighting, in terms of like this concept of risk, right? So I think eventually this will go away in favor of something else. I don't know exactly what that's going to be yet. But probably some idea around scoring or something else that helps us get folks onto the maturity model itself, right? In terms of categorically where they fit. So there is, so I guess to go back to your question, we will have some way of weighting these questions. There isn't today like a sense of, if you answered yes to this or no, like it's really intended to be fairly straightforward and simple. And the reason I do that is because when I conduct the interview, um, I usually have a bunch of different personas involved. So it could be the platform engineers, it could be the executive sponsor on the call, it could be folks from the developer experience side of things, it could be an end user of the platform. Um, and like we basically try to get a consensus on a yes no answer for these questions, right? So unlike other sort of formats like a developer survey or things that we might do, we're not interviewing individuals, we're interviewing like a cohort of people who are involved in platform engineering and trying to get a sense of where they think they are. And sometimes they don't agree, and that's fine. And I think those questions help us identify topics that we want to discuss like in more detail, right? So it may be that the platform team thinks they're doing really good and the end users disagree, or the end users think they're doing really good and the platform team is thinking they need to do more work in that area. I've seen both cases. Um, but the intention is not that this is kind of like I equate it to like going to the doctor, right? You go to the doctor kind of asks how you're feeling. He kind of, looks at a couple things. He's not doing like x-rays and all the stuff, right? He's just kind of getting like a relative picture of where you are and saying, hey, you should probably do a little bit more exercise and cut back on the bacon, right? That's pretty much all we're trying to do at this point.
That's a really helpful clarification. I could never take a doctor seriously. He says cut back on bacon. So, thank you for that, Corbin.
Yeah.
I did have a kind of one of follow on point similar to Ted's in some of the questions already, Corbin. There were some of the things that were there aren't necessarily a yes no style question. There's one about, I think, the developer self service and golden paths. And I think some of them is a bit more of a maturity model thing. Does it have a golden path? Is it a backstage UI type process, or do you have API, CLI? What happens if you have all of those? Might be better if those were kind of multiple choice or multiple selects, because the more you've got, probably the more mature you are and the better that is. So when we're weighting it, that's probably seen as a better thing to have more than just one. Don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I don't know. Part of this has been a little bit of discovery as well, like in terms of how people think about certain things. And I've like discovered a few patterns going through this, working with different organizations on how they organize themselves and how they offer like different types of services. And there's a lot of different orientations. So to some extent, it's trying to be a little bit more open, and just asking like, what are the types of interfaces? Um, but again, like, because right now this is done in more of an interview format, it also lends itself well to identifying topics for discussion after. So it could be that they say, we have a backstage portal. It could be they say we don't have a developer experience focus area at all. And there's like it's a namespace as a service offering that people use, and it's a, and people use, the Kubernetes CLI as their front end, right? So there's a lot of ways that people kind of look at these things, and therefore, like, it's trying to be fairly open to that, I guess, at this moment. But I think we'll continue to refine it using your input.
Right. And that gets to the point as well about that developer experience team might not necessarily be inside the platform team, right? In a larger org, chances are that's probably a completely different team that are focused on kind of enabling developer tooling and developer experience and hand holding them through the process, completely separate perhaps to the CTO team that looks after the platform.
It
And
is.
that
And I'm wondering if that's like the best way or not. But yeah, like I think you guys probably have some perspective on that. But that is one of the things that I've been picking up a lot around the place as well.
Yeah, again, it's the usual, my usual talk about scale, right? The larger the organization, probably the more prevalent that approach is going to be. But we saw at KubeCon there was an awful lot of smaller orgs, the ones that were certainly sub 2,000 people across the entire org, where the platform team was trying to do most of that stuff because they largely only had kind of one area that was classed as IT, and it was being deemed as an IT thing. So they were dealing with a lot of that, and the platform team was probably doing more than what you would expect them to be doing in a larger org, right? They were having to do everything because there was no one else. So different perspectives based on the different sizes of company, I think, and I do still think that should be one of our questions. What size is your org? What complexity is your org? Because we do see a difference in our conversations that we're all having. The coffee chats with Dave, etc. We get different sized people come in. There's not many that are at the real big size, like the French railway guy who's got 283,000 people, right? There's not many
You're
companies that size.
one of the big ones as well.
Yeah, SAP was another one, right? Some really big companies out there, but there's an awful lot in our conversations we had certainly at KubeCon that were in the up to 2,000 sort of mark. There weren't really that many between the 2,000 and 10,000 because you had that big jump suddenly that then went to enterprises. So if we're asking the questions to some of those teams that were in our chats, we're talking about maybe 200 developers was the max they were talking about, not 5,000 or 10,000 that were in some of the round tables.
Matteo, I noticed that you've got your hand up.
Yeah, sorry. So I see some overlap with the platform engineering interview script. I'm sending the link right now. There are some interesting questions that I think that could be included in this one, like the designated platform team, the size and the roles, so in the background part. But there are also some other questions, like are users like requesting new capabilities? How often you prioritize or you revisit your priorities? There are some that I think that could be beneficial for this one. If you are okay with that, I'll try to get them into a comment, and then we can chat like async about it, because it's like at least like 3-4 questions that I think would be nice to add to this one.
Yeah, so it's actually a bit along the line I was thinking. Like, Corbin, you said you have tested and sort of like tested this on different teams. Like, do you put them all in one room and say, now we're going to do the assessment and you go through it, or you like pick 2 different teams to see the different angles? Because I can definitely see very different angles depending on what people respond. Like a platform team would be like, yes, we are self-service. They can write their own code and put it in GitHub and we'll review it. While the developer would be like, it doesn't really feel like self-service.
Yeah, so the way that I have been doing it so far is getting the folks in the same room. And there's definitely some bias in there, right? So, but yeah, that's how I've been doing it so far. And so it's a little bit different, like I think I think there's need for like different things, right? In the organization. This isn't like the one thing that you go do and then you have uh you know all the answers you need, right? Part of this is to develop the muscle to do some other activities that you might need to do, right? So like, for example, one of the organizations I'm working with right now doesn't have any platform KPIs, right? And they have no sort of process around that or muscle for that, right? So we had to help like start developing what those KPIs are, identify who the stakeholders are that need to like be part of that, um, develop a methodology for sharing those on a regular basis and reviewing them. Like, so it's kind of embedded in here in like some of the questions around having that muscle, but like you need to do that activity. It's the same thing with like developer surveys and feedback surveys and things. That's the vehicle for getting feedback from the community of users of the platform. So you need to do that as well, right? Like, so this is really, I think, to me, like so far, has really been about understanding the platform engineering team, how they operate, um, their maturity as a team, and but you do need some outside point of view. So having at least, a couple of folks from the developer community that are usually like champions of the platform, right? That are supportive is really useful.
I did have one specific question, Corbin. It was under interfaces, and it was, does the platform provide daily utility to developers? What were you meaning by daily utility? Is that like daily use?
Yeah, it is. So it kind of comes from more of the developer experience side of things, which is really trying to understand, you know, in the developer experience space, or if you have a developer portal, it's really about how do you um, get use from, or how do developers get use from the platform on a regular basis? So are they being able to see their observability from a centralized place? Like, all the things that you would think about the developer has to do on a regular basis. Can they see pull requests? Can they see Jira tickets, or other things that they need to do to be efficient? So that's really around that concept of like daily utility. It may or may not fit in here. It just depends on, like, I think what your guys' feedback is. Does it make sense or not?
Well, I think
And some of that fits in metrics as well, right? About how you measure their daily usage and involvement with the, maybe not platform, but that whole end-to-end experience.
there is an intentionality component to that, though, because if a platform team is building something just to make their life easier, they might just be providing a platform that's just about installing the app through Terraform and then, let the devs handle it from there. So, the helps a little with the definition of platform itself on whether or not it is
Yeah.
a self-service, ongoing, maintained layer by the platform team, or if it's a set of tools to do something, right? And then, hands off from there.
And Dave, the developer platform, we've talked about that before. It could be platform of platforms, right? So you may
Yep.
have a backstage portal fronting off to lots of different platforms as kind of one signposting location and one way of driving traffic to those different platforms that different teams look after.
Yep. And that day-to-day experience, I guess the question comes down to, does the platform have a runtime component, right? If it's just a pipeline, then, and there's no like runtime services in it. And what I mean by that is, does the platform interact with the runtime environment of the apps? It could just be for observability purposes or whatever. I'm not saying it needs to provide like naming services or other things, but if there's if it's just a pipeline that deploys and there's no like portal to observability, or there's none of that stuff other than just a deployment process, that's a different kind of platform than, sort of what we're trending towards, right?
Yeah,
The
we
thing, one of,
we used to talk about the single point of glass entryway for all of the developers. So like you go to backstage and you can find directions to everything. Over time, some things might be embedded into it, but for the new guy who joins the team, like this is where you go, this is how you find everything. Good luck, and you should pretty much be able to like go on your own from there.
Yeah, it's almost your signpost, right? You can click on the links
Yeah,
there, and it'll take you,
exactly.
or it'll give you the information on how to get to those things. But that's very different from that single pane of glass view where everything's embedded. That's much
Yes,
more. I think that's harder to do, to be honest.
it's insanely hard to do.
Yeah.
In my
somewhat to
opinion,
contradict myself, if the user is doing builds and deployments all the time, but doesn't actually interact with it, that seems like a perfectly valid, like, platforms get good enough that the users don't necessarily think about it, right? So that's another factor. So maybe the KPIs around the service levels that the platform is providing, as opposed to KPIs or telemetry of interaction, would be valuable too.
Yeah, and that probably gets back to
Abby put her
those.
hand up.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I know my internet is maybe shoddy, so I
We
just
hear
wanted
you.
to say one thing. One thing I'm noticing is that we pushed quite hard on the model itself to make sure we were talking about outcomes and not implementations. And so I would just say, like, as we evolve this, and I know these are the early conversations, but as we evolve this, making sure we stick to that intention, because whether or not someone uses a portal or whether or not they have embedded and whether or not their runtime or build time and all these things are implementations, that we may have assumptions over what that means for the effectiveness or impact of the platform, but what we should be helping people measure is their impact. And so maybe that I'll add that. When I was listening, I was trying to keep track of what are the big picture things we're trying to incorporate in our questions, and I'll take notes and make sure to share what I've captured and make sure we get to the same page on that. And maybe I'll add that to the list, and just wanted to call it out.
in my opinion, like who is the main user of the platform? That is like developer centric, or that is like DevOps centric, or like infrastructure engineering centric. Like if it's a developer centric, I would like as a developer visit the platform and like do it daily, like my morning when I start my working day, and grab all information about how service running, what is going on. Maybe I need to launch a new resource for myself to do like my task, etc., etc. And that is like very simple reason why developer like should go into the platform, and that is like will define functionality of the platform. And if we're looking like more SRE or like infrastructure team, there is will be totally different tools, totally different interfaces, and like then we'll like continue our discussion about okay, there's a set of pipelines, and it doesn't require internal developer portal.
Yeah, and just my follow on was really just to what you were saying, David. The maturity of the backstage UI, CLI, or API. I think the more mature your team, chances are they're not going to use that backstage UI. They're probably going to use the CLI on a daily basis, or they're going to use the API in some of their pipelines. So they're probably higher up the maturity curve than the people who are actually using the backstage UI. It's not to say the question's wrong. They're good questions. Do you have these things? But it's probably the back to Corbin and the weighting. The weighting's probably better on CLI and API because that tends to be more mature teams that will use that. Not necessarily. Somebody could just start out using the CLI because they prefer that, but it's probably higher order maturity. Dave.
Am I? No, I'm not muted. I'm,
Oh, your
going
hand's
back
still
to
up there.
Abby's. What's that? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Um, so going back to Abby's point about the outcomes nature of like the maturity model, right? And, maybe looking at um some of the like intersections, like adoption, scalable adoption is intrinsic pull, right? And it just happens to be under as a product and investment, right? If you're building a good platform, and I noticed that under the adoption, like it's a little more skewed towards in the questionnaire, like how are you getting adoption in a large company? Is it and effectively it seems to be oriented around push. And then there's a bit about like contribution, but I think between investment and adoption, it isn't clear where the demand comes from, right? And whether or not you're treating users as customers, which is, of course, the big push that we're trying to figure out with the platform as a product, right? Research. So I think if you're trying to get to outcomes, maybe there's a way to push the questions along a little differently, um, and maybe answer for ourselves, like what is the outcome of having intrinsic pull for adoption, right? Higher utilization, um, higher utilization, but higher, I guess, utility, right, to the users, as opposed to, and that's the adoption curve being you must use this versus you can use this and you want to use this mean very different outcomes, right, for developers. Some of this comes down to something we kind of dance around, like measuring developer productivity or satisfaction or whatever, which is like that's our ultimate outcome. We want the lowest amount of or highest amount of satisfaction from users to achieve the highest, level of business outcome.
So, so that right there, David, is like I think one of the biggest challenges I see, especially in like these larger organizations, like Chris said, where you have like a developer experience team that's maybe over here, and you have a platform team who's like over here, and they're kind of loosely coupled, right? And when we talk to the platform team about like driving value, right, where we always come back to this idea around um the developer, like it's about developer productivity at the end of the day, right? And making sure that you can ship software faster with better quality. Like if those things aren't in alignment, or if the KPIs don't measure that entire end to end, like, you know, thing, like it becomes challenging, right? And so those are some of the things that I'm dealing with, just like in terms of internal politics within an organization, right? Why you guys keep your platform KPIs over there? Those things are like maybe like availability or something, availability of the platform, or like something else like that. And leave the developer experience stuff to us, and we use Dora and other things over here. But never should those two things overlap or meet, right? And I'm like,
Yeah, and the
okay,
developer
guys,
experience,
like,
like there's a separate developer tools team, right? And so platform gets essentially held to just infrastructure related stuff rather than taking in the whole was ideally, developers aren't interacting with the infrastructure all the time, right? They're interacting with the tools they use to actually build the important parts of their applications, of which the infrastructure is not one, right? So, um, that's maybe something we need to figure out for future, but for this, I lost my train of thought on the yeah, I see the same divide between sort of infrastructure and developer tools that seems unnecessary and then makes it difficult to deliver. And I regain my train of thought. The other way I see this is a consequence of how the platform teams just describe their own work and user stories. They say, as a platform engineer, I want like they're constantly looking at it from their perspective and trying to figure out how it relates outcome wise. Even if there is an actual user involved, they don't think of it that way.
I mean, that friction piece that you're kind of describing, Corbin, right? That it's part of the problem. You've got teams that are focused on doing things themselves and they want to do everything themselves, right? They're addicted to the AWS tools and Terraform. They've built up and they've skilled up and they want to do all that themselves. They really don't want to use a platform team's offering where all that's abstracted away from them. And that was kind of one of your questions in there. I've talked about it before in this group about those kind of three types of personas. There's probably more than three, but we know we've got those kind of developers who want to do everything themselves. We know that we've got people who maybe aren't as mature and they use kind of ticket ops to get things done. And then we know there's people who do want to use the platform method, right? We kind of need to, when we're assessing, find out where those people sit in that spectrum to understand the perspective, because there are the people out there that doesn't matter what you make available, doesn't matter how much you try and want to work with them, they still won't use your platform because they want to do it themselves. And that's been around since 2017, right? That famous line that everyone wants a platform, but they want to build it themselves. I don't think
I've met quite a few that don't want to build it themselves.
Yeah,
they just want the silver bullet,
which doesn't exist, right? So it's all about co-creation as well, which was a good question to see about how do people actually contribute.
So I'm kind of focused
you,
in on
Dave.
investment because of the platform as a product. And one of the things I'm noticing about the maturity model is like there's this enormous step function jump between 2 and 3, like the going from the left from dedicated teams. Everyone's got dedicated teams, right? And going from dedicated team to product thinking is a huge gap. And then going to ecosystems is like once you understand product thinking, layered products aren't as big of a jump as figuring out product thinking. So maybe in the questionnaire, we kind of tease out a bit more of that emphasis on product thinking, customer, because we know that a lot of places are going to, once you get past the funding gap and the dedicated team, right? Because that is a big gap for a lot of places, like having a team dedicated. Then the next huge jump is like to product thinking. And I don't even know if we think like, I don't know of many places that actually have the ecosystem even in mind because they're still trapped in dedicated team, but not thinking about customers. So I think we need to mention more about customers and customer interaction and investment and a bit this crossover to adoption too. Do you, and it's in adoption, it's just called intrinsic pull, right? The extrinsic push versus intrinsic pull, and maybe make more, figure out how to focus the questions there. I think that might help people orient themselves a little differently if we take some work through the questions to define here's what you've achieved when there's pull adoption, here's what you've achieved when you have a product, and you can kind of work out that they're related.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting about that is just the scale of questions we have to ask. So one thing I'm curious about, and I know I blacked out there for a bit as we were parking the car, so I might have missed it, but is whether or not there's been any thought on the number of questions that are currently on the list, either for more or for less, or for it's the right number, because that's going to help us start to understand, do we need to be thinking about expanding the questions or refining the questions? And I did hear the comment about the kind of conjunctions, like that, keeping the questions simple, but obviously fewer questions, more complexity does lend itself to more ands or ors or whatever kind of in the question. So I'd love to hear how people think about that on the scale of questions we're currently proposing.
I think like if they have a dedicated team, and in my opinion, dedicated team like will always think about like we're doing like product. but main question, they're doing a product, in infrastructure as a product, and communication with the customer, it's going through the ticket system, like open a ticket and we will update our product. Or they will provide a self-service platform where it will be a product, but where user are able to do all operations that they want, and they don't need like I can say like a little bit rude human interaction. Like I open ticket and some do this job for me, or I go to the like self-service, make some action and it's done automatically. And I think like we need to make a like distinction between these two dedicated teams and these two products.
In terms of the number of questions, there might be an opportunity to, instead of thinking of it maybe as like either expanding or contracting the number of questions, we might be able to pivot some of the questions. So instead of being yes or no, they're multiple choice. And then some of the questions, like question in the investment section, they do have a dedicated team aligned to build and maintain, and questions further down about whether they're primarily working on the development of a new platform. If we made one question that was multiple choice that said, like, what does your team look like? Obviously worded slightly better than that, with many options, we might be able to wrap into one question something that identifies maybe 2 or 3 of these questions, as long as it can be done gracefully. So I think that might be one way to explore to make it so that it feels like an easier task for people if they're doing a self-assessment. And ideally, the multiple choice questions, like for each question would say for that question, it kind of places you here, right? It's like more towards the left or more towards the right, which the questions already do that, right? Because if you don't have a dedicated team, that's like pushing you more to the left. So I think like I like these questions. I think they're a good way. I can see how you could place people. Maybe if we did multiple choice, it might even identify if we've got a gap where we wouldn't position someone because we don't actually ask. So that was my thought on the number of questions.
Yeah, I put something in the chat, Abby, just to say, I went through it, felt like a decent amount of questions. If you're having a conversation, the way Corbin's been using it, feels like the right kind of leading amount of questions. You don't want to have too many, but you want to have enough that you're kind of, and it just felt every section felt about the right amount and the right questions to be asking. So for a starter for 10, I thought it was really good. Just it felt very balanced, to be honest, and I could tell that Corbin's clearly been using it because you create that list over time, right, and you try and add a few more, but it definitely read like it had been practiced. So, and I forwarded it to myself to try and use, right, as well. So, yeah, definitely looks.
Corbin's done a great
set.
job with it. I think it's really interesting as well what you were saying, Steve, and I wrote in the chat, like, one of the things that's interesting that I've heard a few times in our different conversations is people's concern that people don't know how to self-evaluate very well. Like that they will point themselves into the wrong spot, basically. And while we have lots of fantastic consultants around our group, and we expect consultants will benefit from this document, we aren't building this for consultants. It's a tool for the teams. And if consultants can help bring it to the teams, great. But that's not our primary target audience. And so one thing that you triggered in my brain there, Steve, was those types of questions where you say, like, would you say you're more like this or like that? And you sort of ask like 3 or 4 questions that, if answered consistently, would paint a picture. But if answered in like, sort of all over the map, it actually paints a picture of like, you're a bit all over the map. And like, and it can highlight that actually the first thing to do is maybe start to identify measurements that would be more like concrete or confident than this subjective question asking. So maybe there's to Corbin's point about asking questions. The original questions were based on this risk model, and we're sort of opening the table to different outcomes for the end of this survey. Maybe there's a different format to use the exact same question with just the slightest different set of answers. Will open up to a different type of outcome of the survey. So something to think about, maybe. But Matteo, go for it.
So I think around this topic, maybe having the questions for developers, the users, the main users of the platform, and the platform builders at the same time, but even a third set of people, like the C level, like where do you see this platform that is being built going on? Like having the same set of questions and the difference in answers can already give data about the maturity model, in my opinion. I did it before, not for platform engineering, for DevOps. I gave a survey out to my customers, same survey, developers, C-level, and engineering managers, or like the team leader, and the answers were really different. So I could get where the gap in communication was, and maybe it's not in scope for this one, but I think it's interesting to explore.
I guess maybe one of the thing, if we're not making this for consultants and the answers are not to collect data, but to help people understand, do we need the questions to be more rubric oriented? And, if you want to declare where you are on this map, how do you answer that for yourself? Because these questions are just questions for us to collect and then return, someone who understands the answers and the context would then come back to a given person. But if you wanted to give this to an org to sort of evaluate themselves, I know people have done it. Like there was the Red Hat team that talked about doing that just last week with just the maturity matrix, basically. But a lot of teams would probably benefit from saying, well, if I think I'm at product, right? What does that mean? If I think I'm at ecosystem, what does that mean? Right? And I think our questions are more information gathering. And if we want people to be able to just use this, then it needs to be more rubric oriented.
Yeah, so the intention is, well, so I've been kind of stuck in this like interim place, right? Which is that the intention is to eventually help people understand what it looks like to be at that next place, right? If it makes sense for them. And so there's two things that happen. One is, does it make sense, right? Like based on where you are, does it make sense to have more investment? For example, maybe it's a small organization. They don't need to like do anything else, right? They could be good. Um, so part of it is kind of that, and then the other part is, what should I do if I'm lacking? Like if I don't have any KPIs today, what is the risk? Like, is there any risk associated with that? And for me, like the investment is at risk, right? You've already built this team, you're building this infrastructure, you're asking developer teams to move and migrate their applications onto this thing, which is, risky and expensive, right? So you have this investment, you're not really measuring it at all. Like, how do I do that? Right. So there's like this notion around prescriptive guidance, which today, like I haven't built because I haven't finished understanding what are we measuring, right? What are the right questions to ask so that we can then say, okay, based on this, right, you should consider this, right? Which I expect would be additional content that comes out of this group around what are the KPIs? How do I measure that? What's the process around that?
Yep.
What are some things that I need to think about? We need to like then build this sort of library of content that helps people understand what these things are. Like David mentioned, the gap to get to product is really big. Like, how do I get there? And do I know if I should even go in that direction? I don't know, right? Like, so it is, I think one of the interesting things for me is right now, because it is interview format, like it fosters a lot more discussion. When we go to like a completely self-service method where somebody could just blindly come in and like do something, they don't they don't know if they're going to shoot themselves in the foot, right? And so we have to be like a little bit cautious that if this is like completely self-service, that people know like where the foot gun is, right? Like that they know like that they're, if they, they may not need to necessarily go to that same thing. And I think that's been a theme of this discussion too, is we don't want everybody aspiring to the right. Some people should aspire to the right, maybe based on the size of organization or some other factors. Some are good where they're at, right? So I think that's something that, has to be teased out of this. And maybe it's like supplemental materials. Maybe it's like something that pops up if it was like an application that tells you like when to consider this or something else. Like, I'm not really sure.
I think I'm first up, but I'm going to let Steve and David go. My goal after you two will be to try and wrap up what we want to do next from here, because I think we've gotten a very good shared understanding. And so the question is, what can we do asynchronously? When's our next call? That kind of thing. But I first want to hear Steve and then David, what y'all want to say.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that I suppose if you like, it was referring to David's point on rubrics. If you imagine the simplest possible questions we could ask, there are 5, right? You'd say, what's your level of investment? Is it voluntary or temporary? Or is it dedicated team? But then we're not helping them, right? The reason we need these questions is because people don't really know. They don't know how to place themselves between product, ecosystem, so the questions really are, in a way, it's like the instructions, but in reverse. So instead of telling them how to map themselves on here, we ask them some questions. And we say, we think these questions mean that you're at the dedicated team zone, or we might even say, like, you're 80% in the dedicated team zone, but also 20% in the product zone, because a couple of your answers actually were moving in that direction, or whatever it is we're going to do. So yeah, like Matteo said, it's like a spectrum. So we can kind of place them with some method across there. So yeah, I just thought that was really, that's where we want to be, right? So that I can sit down knowing I've seen the maturity model, I don't get it, but I can then just answer a couple of questions and it tells me you're a dedicated team. And then I can answer the next question that says, oh, you're erratic, which is kind of true. So yeah. David.
So, a couple of things. Corbin, your mention of KPIs, that feels like, again, an implementation detail. And the questions I would want to see around measurement are more of that. Are you doing measurement at all? Is it ad hoc? Do you do consistent, not like that they're tracking DORA or anything like that? Because I know of a cable company that went from like deployments every few weeks to multiple deployments a day by only tracking developer satisfaction. They never tracked DORA. So I think saying what specific KPIs or anything, it's more, what I'm starting to hear is like, we need to define what provisional is and why you would be provisional in any of these categories. We need to define what and scalable. Like, everyone wants to be Netflix, but not everyone should aspire to be Netflix, right? Or needs to be. So, why would you want to be scalable in any one of these categories? And I think, scalable, it's dual meaning, like as a product. Well, you need as a product to be scalable, but in order to be, in order to scale as a business, you might need to go in that product oriented direction, right? So the I think it would be really useful for us to, and this might be a future version of the maturity model too, that kind of explains these things.
Well, I was going to say, I think possibly doing a reread of the model for everybody. It has been out for a while now, and I haven't read it in full for a few months and whatnot, because there are definitely attempts towards this. Now, how successful those attempts are in reality versus in my brain of what we did when we published it, it's 2 very different things, and there could very well be gaps. But I do imagine, like, this rubric tells you are this. You should be able to go to the model and read that and have that give you more detail about what it means. Just like when someone does a personality test and is like, you're INTJ. What does this mean? You can go look up what introvert is. You can go look up what feeling is. You can go look up whatever. We should have that. My hope would be that the model could support that. You are provisional in measurement. Go read the model provisional measurement and you'll understand more of what that means. So we have 5 minutes left. Just want to call that out. And what I don't want to have happen is us all have this amazing conversation, get this good alignment, and then just walk away not sure what's going to happen next. So Chris, I know you've had your hand raised. Is there something that would help us wrap up the conversation, or should we move on to sort of the next steps? What do you think?
Only thing I was going to say, Abby, was I put it in the chat. We mentioned outcomes. It'd be good to capture what the current problems are when we're asking the question, right? So that we can use that to steer. I think that, what are your current problems? I think when they've answered some of the questions, that adds to then, the steer that we give them, exactly what you were saying, right? How we'd say, go and have a look at your investment, go and have a look at this. But we do need to capture the problems that they're having at the moment. That's it.
Agreed. And I think that's one of the things I captured, and I'll have to get my notes into a better format for people, but I've shared them in the chat of sort of out of scope-ish for today's call, but definitely not for this piece of work, which is how do we evaluate what it is you need? So today's call is focusing on how do we evaluate where you are? That is independent. Like you could be a, enterprise 20,000 employee enterprise ready platform, but only be at 100-person company. Like you could be a 100-person kind of company level platform and you have a 20,000 employees. Right now, we're not evaluating that gap yet. We're just saying, how do we put you somewhere on the map? Now we need to back up eventually and ask some questions of how do we evaluate where you should be on the map based on what your goals are, based on what your organization shape is, based on, what your current pains are and those things. Then we can start talking about that gap between the two. So absolutely. In my opinion, that's well within the scope of the bigger project work. David, same question to you. Is there anything that would help wrap us up here or next step sort of?
I just left my hand up. Sorry.
Oh, no worries. Cool. So as I said, my biggest goal is that, we've had the summer months. The summer months are tough for everybody with holidays with kids and holidays with themselves and good weather distracting you and all those good things. But we're coming into autumn. And I think we have a goal of trying to have something we can show people at Salt Lake City to energize the group, to get feedback around the direction we're moving. I don't expect this to be a published white paper by Salt Lake, but I'm hoping to have it there by London. And so if by Salt Lake we're getting feedback and we're getting confidence in the direction of travel, then we're there for London easily, right? So how do we move from the conversation today, which I'm hearing a lot of general alignment, general like smoothing of misunderstandings between what's written and what people are hearing and what people's experiences are, but kind of moving, we're all kind of collating together. How do we move from that to a set of questions that we have confidence will place people on this model in a effective way, in a self-service effective way? I think that was one of the key changes of this original set of questions to the use case we're going to be doing within our group. Does anyone have any ideas?
I think for me, it would be useful. Like I know that there was more to the model, but I kept getting hung up on even getting past so I think it would be really neat to look at each section and see how well it matches up with the written model, not the table, and see if the questions there allow someone to see themselves in those characteristics and scenarios, right? And that I think would let us know if we're on the right track with the questions.
Do you want to, we did a thing when we were writing the model itself where we sort of assigned some people to each of the sections to sort of do reviews like that. And we need to get down to one voice eventually. But right now, just alignment doesn't have to worry so much about that singular voice of writing style. Do we want to try and do that? Does anyone who's on the call today want to raise their hand as sort of leading the charge for a section? And that doesn't mean you have to do it all by yourself. You can pair up and whatnot. But if we do that and then we join back up again in like maybe 2 weeks, we can hopefully have had a lot of asynchronous conversations and a lot of like confidence that we're either where we are missing or where we are hitting that alignment with the model. That's like a good plan.
Putting targets on people is the only way to get work done. So I have a natural inclination towards investment, so I can work
David,
on that.
we're a community that is completely free of any payment or anything else. We do no targets, just opportunities. But yes, I hear you, David. Investment. Yeah. Feel free to jump onto that one. Steve, what are you thinking? Is this an okay plan forward?
Yeah, I like the idea. I'm kind of keen in a way to maybe I can contribute by helping to kind of map that work into some kind of matrix to make sure we've got all bases covered. But I can contribute to if like any of these as well. I can do it at that lower level if that helps.
So I think like one of the things to keep in mind in this approach is that right now, like these questions don't map you to a maturity level on the model, right? So we have to start thinking that way, right? Which is if you look at the set of questions and I answered yes, no, where does that put me? Right? Does that put me in a specific level? And so I think this is a great like idea, Abby, if we break out into teams that are looking at each category. But as you're doing that, like think about that, right? If I answered yes to all these questions, am I, you know, on the high end of maturity? Am I in the low end? Like which one am I in? And it's probably not going to be super black and white right now. So we
That's a
may
good
have
point,
to
Corbin,
change the
because
question.
we also sort of talked about should this be more multiple choice, and so we're at 5 o'clock now. I don't feel comfortable being 100% certain what the next steps are. I don't want to rush through that in the last minute. I'd rather do that through asynchronous chat on Slack and come up with the right next steps than try and like shove next steps in because we got to the end of our hour. But I think there is something around the kind of a deeper look at the questions to make sure they cover the sections we expect and that they start to map people onto the model. And I think there's a question there that you raised really well, Corbin, of like, is it the yes, no questions? How will those actually matrix into or like map into the model itself? So if anyone has an idea, feel free to throw it in Slack. I'll do the same and have a think about that. And hopefully in the next day or so, we'll have some sort of an idea of a plan. I will try and keep track of who's in the call now and try and tag people into the chat to say, this is our next step and we need people to sort of jump into a section if they're interested, and therefore you all have a chance to sign up for it when we do get to that point. Because I do think it'll be something about diving deep into things and really making sure we're putting some deeper thought in. Because, as we've said many times, Corbin's done a great job of putting deep thought in, and you can see the impact of that. People really get value from it. And so that's where we now need to step up and do our part and do the same thing at this stage. So,
Abby, I'll make a thread for you in Slack so you don't have to. I'll just capture everyone and make a thread with them.
Amazing. That's great. I do have my laptop once I get back. I just, the beach was really pretty.
Take as much holiday as you can.
But yeah, so I will be more distant over the week, but feel free to move forward. I shouldn't be blocking in any way. If we get to a consensus of a good way forward with any subset of this group, I feel really comfortable. I think it's been a really productive call, basically, in getting us all on the same page, moving in the same direction, and now it's just taking that next step forward. So, awesome. Hope you all have a great day.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Hope you will have a great vacation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Enjoy.
Get some more crab in
Until
me.
next time.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.